school. If somebody would close those doors for me. Thank you. Okay, well, let's begin with prayer, and then we'll dive into Genesis. God, I thank you for your goodness and your plan of salvation that started from the beginning and how we can see it traced through the Bible. Lord, I thank you for the depths and riches of your wisdom that are displayed here, and just how so much of the things that we talk about just show your glory and who you are and how you love us. And even the flood showed your great love for humanity and hatred of sin, but how you brought a salvation plan through it. And I thank you for that. And Lord, I thank you how we can see Jesus from beginning to end. And Lord, I pray that you'd open our eyes and help us to not just know things, but live them out for your glory. Amen. All right, so last week we did talk about the flood. Jeff filled in for me and kind of talked about the details of Genesis 6 through 8, what happened, how the family, Noah's family built the ark and all those things. And so thank you, Jeff, wherever you are, right there, for your work. And so let's do a little exercise. Sloan, we won't be passing around the mic, but shout out for me. Let's try to remember the details of the flood story as it occurred. So starting with God chooses Noah. What happens next? Chooses Noah. Told him to build an ark, right? Noah was 600 years old. So if you guys are 600 years old and God tells you to build an ark, go ahead and do that, right? Okay, so what happens next? Builds an ark. What's the ark like? It's huge, right? Massive. The word for ark is just the word for box in Hebrew. Same word for Ark of the Covenant. Same word for when Moses is put in a little box and floated down the river as a baby. He's put in an ark. Okay, but this ark is huge. God gave the plans, right, of exactly how long and how wide and how tall. How long did the rain last? Well, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and there's a little confusion. Maybe Jeff can help me. It sounds like it also goes for 150 days, right? The waters kept coming up from below for 150 days, and finally they were shut off after that. What happened after that 150 days? Or how high was the water? It covered the mountains at a height of 20 cubits, all right? So it was way over the mountains even, okay? After that, what happened? Did it just dry up right away, or? He sent out a bird. How many of them? And what kinds? Raven first, and the raven didn't come back, right? Which means it probably died, okay? It didn't have anywhere to land. And then he sent a dove 7 days later, and it. Anybody remember? We're skipping some steps. The ark came to rest on Mount Ararat, which is in modern-day Turkey, I think. Right? Yep. Okay. And so, does he get out of the ark right away? No. He waits a good number of days, I think 29 days later. I read in here, he removes the cover of the ark, and after another 56 days, God commands them to get out of the ark, and the earth is dry. Okay? And is that the end of the story? What does Noah do immediately after he gets out of the ark? He makes a sacrifice. Okay? And then God promises, he makes his covenant with the rainbow, right? And then things happen later in chapter 9. Good. Okay, so 2 Sundays ago, so not last Sunday, but the Sunday before that, we talked about the cause, the reason for the flood. Why did God send a flood? sin. Every thought and intention of the human heart was only evil all the time, it says in Genesis 6. People had become that bad. The sons of God went into the daughters of men. Remember we talked about that. Had children by them. There were the Nephilim that came on the earth. And there's an interesting verse. If you have chapter 6 open, it's verse 7. God says, the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I've made them. How does God regret something he did? Does that mean that he made a mistake? I don't think so. I don't think we can say God made a mistake. Certainly not. Does it mean that he didn't know that this was going to happen? Like, did he not know that humanity would get this bad? He knows everything. That can't be the case, though some people have argued that type of theology. It's called open theology, that God knows all things currently, but he doesn't know what the future because human beings have a free will. That's wrong, okay, just so you know. He knows everything. So what does it mean that he regretted? It means that he felt deeply sorrowful and sad. The flood didn't come out of annoyance. It came out of sorrow. Sadness, because he loves humanity. He loved the world he created. And so that was the problem. But he found comfort in the person of Noah. Remember that the name Noah means rest. And in the Bible, names are really important, especially Jesus' name, God's name, Yahweh, but even people's names. And Noah's name, meaning rest, is important because remember the last time we heard the word rest? What chapter of Genesis was that? 4? It's actually 2, right at the beginning of 2, right? On the seventh day, God rested from all his labors. And it doesn't mean he took a nap. It meant that God established control over the chaos and was running the world the way it was supposed to be run, right? It's the analogy I used before. He sits on the captain's seat, and now he's ready to take charge because everything is the way it's supposed to be. He found that rest in Noah. Noah was the chance for him to restart because Noah, look at verse 9, the second part. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. The world was corrupted. There was violence. Everything had gone wrong. People were terribly sinful, but God found rest in Noah, and he brought him through into a new creation. And so human sinfulness was the cause, was the reason why the flood happened. We know the details of the flood, but what's the meaning? What's the purpose of the flood? What did God hope to bring out of it? It wasn't just God doesn't just rage on for no reason. You know, I'm so mad, I'm going to do this, and there's no reason. There's a reason for the flood, and we need to look at that. We need to know the reason so that we can apply its truth to our lives, to see what God has done, even through the flood and how it affects us, right? I think what would be helpful, though, is to look at some other versions of the story, or to talk about them. We actually have several versions of the flood story from other ancient cultures, as you've heard, probably. It's the same story that they're telling, but they're telling it in slightly different ways, even though some of the details are remarkably similar between ancient stories and the biblical story of the flood. The details may be very similar, but the point of the flood is very different. It shows who God is and what he wants. So let's talk about some of these different flood stories. There are many of these other flood accounts were written before the Bible was written, actually. So, for instance, the most well-known of them, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Have you ever heard of that before? Yeah. the oldest, we have a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh that's dated around 2000 BC, right? But people think that it was probably written even around 4000 BC. It may be the oldest copy of literature that we've ever found before, right, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Moses, who wrote Genesis, wasn't born until 500 years after 2000 BC, around 1500, right? And this Epic of Gilgamesh was a Babylonian account. There are other accounts as well. So Eridu Genesis was written in Sumerian. Atrahasis was written in Babylonian. There was another flood account found in 2014 on a tablet the size of a cell phone. We keep finding things. I don't know if you've realized this, but in the last 100 years, we have found so many things from the ancient world that have helped us to understand the Bible. Even like this is still happening. And so we found this, or they found, I didn't have anything to do with it, but they found it, and it's from Ugarit. And there are similarities and there are differences between the accounts. And to me, that does not show that they copy. The Bible is not copying these stories, because even though it shares details with some of them, it shares certain details with different ones of them. It's not like it was copying Gilgamesh or something like that, because there are so many differences as well. But it shows that there was a tradition of an historical event, a cataclysmic event that changed society, that was so impactful that people around the world, almost every culture, for some reason we don't have one from Egypt, a flood story from Egypt, though who knows, we might find one soon. That's a real possibility. But we have all these flood accounts, and it's so interesting that they share similarities with the Bible. And so let me share briefly some of these similarities that these other accounts had. Like the Bible, many of these stories start with the creation of the world and human beings, and then move on to talking about the flood. People seem to think that there was a close connection to when the world was created, or when things were happening with the creation of the world, and the flood coming after, which is interesting. In these accounts, including the Bible, God, or in all the other accounts, God's plural, are displeased with humans in some way. And that's why the flood occurs. The reason for why they're displeased is different, but they're displeased in some way. In every one of those accounts that we've found, as far as I know, I'm pretty sure this is right, God, or the gods, choose one individual to build a boat or an ark, and they instruct them to do it because a flood is coming. And so in the Bible, the person's name is Noah. In other accounts, the guy's name is Zoostria. They're so hard to pronounce. Atrahasis, Utranapisti. That's from Gilgamesh. In that tablet that's the size of a cell phone from 2014, the animals are described as coming in 2 by 2, just like in the Bible. In the Gilgamesh story, the ark comes to rest on a mountain after 7 days, though it's a different mountain. Like Noah, the guy from the Gilgamesh epic releases 3 birds to see if the water has receded, though they are, one's a dove and one's a raven, but another one's a swallow, and they're all in different order. Like Noah, the hero who survives the flood in the Eridu Genesis account offers a sacrifice right after the waters recede. And some of these accounts give very descriptive details about the construction of the ark, though the arks are all in different shapes or different sizes. Like some are like a coracle, some are like a box, things like that. In the Gilgamesh epic, the boat is 1 full acre in floor space. I'm not good at acres. I bet you guys are, some of you are better, but you can imagine maybe how much that is. And equal in length and in height, so it's massive. In other accounts, the ark is maybe smaller, but there's one detail about the ark that seems to be true across the board, which is that the floor spaces of the arks are nearly identical. which is interesting. But there are lots of differences between the Bible and the other accounts. These stories have different names for the heroes. They're written in different time periods and in different countries and languages, which is interesting. The length and the duration of the flood is almost always different. The size and the shape of the ark, besides the floor space, is usually different. In the Gilgamesh epic, and in other ones too, the flood is represented as a foolish decision made by the gods. And the gods are even scared of the flood. Like they are depicted as like dogs that are whining and scared. It's interesting. The other gods of other cultures, this is true pretty much across the board besides the Bible when it comes to talking about gods and other cultures. They're portrayed as selfish and vengeful people, right? They do things for their own reasons because they're selfish, that sort of thing. But the God of the Bible is shown to be wise and concerned about the world. And even the destruction of humans in the Bible is seen as a good thing for humanity and for the creation. God's doing this. He's bringing out Noah for the good of mankind that he created, because mankind had become sinful, right? They become totally corrupt, but he saved one and brought a whole world through him, right? But the gods in the other stories, they use humans, right? And when they destroy them with the flood, it's foolish because they're cutting off their own food supply. In the ancient world, people thought of sacrifices as feeding the gods. The gods had to be clothed. They had to have a house, which was a temple. They had to be fed every day or they'd go hungry. They needed humans to serve them and be their slaves. And so when they destroyed them all, it was like, oh, why did we do that? But there's no such thought in the Bible. God doesn't need people. Sacrifice isn't described at all in a way that's talking about like it's his food. He, in fact, says in different places things like, I don't need that, you know. So there's a lot of differences, and the main difference, not only in the flood story, but in the Bible, the thing that makes the Bible so unique in the ancient world and even today, is that there's only one God, acting sovereignly, acting providentially. He knows what's going to happen. He's in control of all of history, and it's just him. That's what's unique about the Bible. In other cultures, it's always, there's lots of gods. They're in conflict. They're always selfish. They're just like people, really, in every way, just more powerful. And so the theological, even though there's a lot of similarities, there's some detailed differences, the theological message then of the flood in the Bible is very different. And knowing how the ancient world thought compared to the Bible is helpful. In other accounts, the gods send the flood because they're selfish. There's no plan. There's no purpose. In fact, they took a misstep. They didn't even think through what they were doing. And humans, the reason is because humans are too noisy. That's why. They're annoying. They're problematic. The gods get tired of dealing with them. But in the Bible, the flood serves God's great purpose. There's a purpose behind it, to bless humanity, to make the world a holy, sacred place for him to dwell. Right? Remember, the world is supposed to be God's home, his holy place, his sacred place where he can be with people. And so this is a reset. The flood is a restart. The flood is meant to restore the earth, and it's presented that way. Right? This is God fixing what's gone wrong, making creation again what it was supposed to be. And I think this is why the flood story was written again in Genesis. I mean, it's history. Everyone knew the basic flood story in every culture in the ancient world. It had been passed down for generations. But there's something that people didn't understand about the flood that the author of the Bible was trying to make clear, the purpose behind it. Yahweh, the God of Israel, that God was the one who sent the flood. the God that Israel worships. And it was sent because sin and corruption of mankind was so bad, and its purpose was to restart with a new creation. I once taught a Bible study when I was living in Wisconsin. And I mentioned something about new creation in the Old Testament. And the people were very offended that because God's creation at the beginning was perfect, right? Why would he need to do it again? And it's true, God's original creation was perfect. But new creation is a theme that stretches throughout the Bible, not only in the Old Testament, but in the New, and we'll get into that. But the way that the author of Genesis shows us that it's a new creation is really interesting. And so I'd like you to open your Bibles and follow along, because Genesis 6 through 9, the flood story and what comes after, is a replay of Genesis 1 through 3. There's a lot of similarities, and so we're going to look at what it said in Genesis 6 through 9, especially starting in chapter 7, and how it relates to what came before. So look at chapter. This is in the middle of the flood. The floodwaters, it says, rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The picture is there's water from below the earth, and there's water from above. That's how they sort of thought of creation. There's there's this level of water above the sky and below the earth, and they were coming together to the point where it's all water, right? Even the mountains are covered. There's no land left. What does that remind you of in Genesis 1? Well, hold on, before that. So it's all water. Before day 1, you remember? There was all water, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the deep. Before it all started. And remember, that's supposed to be telling us there's chaos. There's no meaning to creation. There's no form. God is bringing it back to that point before day 1, right? When it was all water, okay? Let's look at chapter 8, verses 13 through 14. By the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the water had dried up from the earth. Noah then removed the covering from the ark and saw that the surface of the ground was dry. By the 27th day of the second month, the earth was completely dry. And so Bob, what does that remind you of? Took you by surprise. Yes, so in other words, God separated out the water from above from the water from below. That's Genesis 1, verses 6 through 10, creating dry land. So he's doing it again. He's creating space for people to live in. He's creating function for people to dwell. He's recreating. Okay, look at verse 17 of chapter 8. 8:17. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so that they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number on it. What does that remind you of in Genesis chapter 1? All the living creatures that God made, and what did he say to the creatures in 1? Be fruitful and multiply. All right? He's saying it again. Okay? Look at verse 20 of chapter 8. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. Okay? That one's a little harder. But does that remind you of anything in Genesis 1 through 3? Noah's making sacrifices. He's... Oh, kind of, yeah. What I'm thinking is that, and this kind of goes back to something I interpreted, but Adam was the first man, and he was placed in the garden to be God's priest, to serve him. And now Noah is the first man. Everybody else is dead besides him and the children that came from him. He's serving as God's priest, offering sacrifices. Look at the next verse, verse 21. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, Never again will I curse the ground because of the humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. Never again will I destroy living creatures as I have done. This is the opposite of what God did in Genesis chapter 3 when he cursed the ground. He says, even though humans are sinful, I will never again curse the ground. All right? So restart. Look at verse 22 of chapter 8. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. Can you think of a part in Genesis 1 that's similar to that? What? Verse 14, what does that say? Right. And then there's also seed time and harvest, day and night. All these things that God established, he's reestablishing, and he's saying that they will never cease, right? The earth will be very good again. Chapter 9, verse 2. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth, and on all the birds in the sky, and every creature that moves along the ground, and on all the fish in the sea, and they are given into your hands. Does that remind you of anything? What about the fact that man is called to subdue and rule over the creatures of the earth? And in chapter 2, Adam names all the creatures, rules over them, right? Man is given dominance, again, over the creatures of the earth. Verse 3. Yeah, let's go fishing. That's right. Verse 3, animals are used as a food source. So that's different. But in Genesis chapter 1, every plant and fruit tree was given as food. Look at chapter 9, verse 20. Let's see if you can get this one, how this relates. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. Any idea how that relates to Genesis 1 through 3? Right. Adam was put in he didn't plant it, God did, but Adam was put in the garden to tend it. And so Noah now is tending a vineyard. Verse 22 through 23. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took... I wanted to start at verse 21. When he had drank some of its wine from the vineyard, he became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it at shoulders. And then they walked in backward and covered their father's naked body. Their faces were turned away so that they could not see their father naked. How do you think that relates to Genesis chapter 3 and the fall? When? Right. Yeah. Who told you? And Ham's eyes were opened, it says in verse 22. He saw his father's nakedness. So Noah didn't see his own. And then in verse 25, cursed be Cain, the lowest of slaves he will be to his brother. Does that relate to anything in chapter 3? After the sin, what happened? The ground was cursed, the woman was cursed, the serpent was cursed, cursing. And we could go on. After the sin and curse of chapter 3, we have the story of the sin of Cain and his subsequent cursing. So, likewise, Ham sins, and his son Canaan, which is weird. Ham sins, and his son Canaan is cursed, just like Cain. And just like Cain was below his brothers, Ham is put below his brothers. After chapter 9 and Ham's cursing, or Ham's sin and the cursing of his son Canaan, we have genealogies in chapter 10. after Cain, we have the genealogy of Cain and of Seth. Seth's family line lasts 10 generations until we get to Noah. Shem, the son of Noah's family line, lasts 10 generations until we get to the righteous Abraham. See, this is a replay in a lot of ways of what happened earlier, but in some ways, God is changing things. He's promising, even though sin is still rampant, he's promising never to flood the earth again, to stick with humanity. And all these parallels are intentional, right? He's making a point. And they're not just interesting parallels, there's a point. The point is that God is starting over. Noah is the new Adam. The flood begins a new creation with what's left over from the original. Humanity has another chance, and God's not going to curse the ground again. But even in this new creation after the flood, humanity is still evil from birth. Did you catch that at the end of chapter 8? God promises he won't do it, but he still says in chapter 8, verse 21, I won't curse the ground again, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And so their eyes, the eyes of humanity, are still open to their nakedness. Mankind still wants to take God's place, which we'll see in the Tower of Babel incident. And their lifespan must be limited. Eternal life's off the table. So, creation, recreation, and new creation is the great overarching theme that runs throughout the entire Bible. You see it from the beginning, you see it in the middle, you even see it in books like Isaiah, right? All the way to the New Testament, and to the very last chapter, when the final creation, a new heavens and a new earth, are made, right? So, Noah is the new Adam, though an imperfect one. All humanity comes from him. So everybody that you know, everybody you see, you go across the world, everybody is genetically related to Adam. But we have a replay of all the same sorts of problems that happened with Adam and Eve, right? Soon we're going to hear about the life of Abraham, starting in chapter 12. He's supposed to be the new one, right? And his descendants are supposed to be a special people, holy to the Lord, the people of Israel. But Israel fails. It's the story of the Old Testament, right? Israel sinned too, the people who were supposed to be his new creation. During the time of Moses, there's this great, the story of the Red Sea. God separates the waters out, just like he did in Genesis 1 and in the flood story. He separates the waters, and then people walk through, and they're a new creation. They're God's new people, the people who come through the Red Sea. But they fail and they sin right away in the same chapter. But though this creation has fallen into corruption, even Israel was full of sin and violence, the jewel of the biblical story, the climax of all of it, is that God did choose a man. He chose a man who would surpass Abraham, who would surpass Noah, who would be a better Adam, who was perfect and sinless. He wasn't just man, but he was fully God and fully man. And when the world was steeped in sin, steeped in darkness, they didn't know their Creator at all. The Creator didn't condemn the world. He didn't send another flood. He sent his one and only Son, not to condemn the world, but to save it. And the cool thing about that new creation, about choosing Jesus, right, is one of the cool things is that in the flood, God recreated the outer world, but the inner person was left unchanged. But through the gospel of Christ's death and resurrection, God has started recreating people, resurrecting them from the inside out. And on the last day, God will resurrect those people and bring about a new heavens and the new earth. So the new creation has already started in us. It's already started, and it will finish. The day's coming. God told Noah, the rain's coming, right? The flood is going to come. It's going to be a new creation. He's told us, right? The flood is coming, or not a flood, the fire, right? The end is coming, but you're going to be a part of it. And so this is 2 Peter. This is how he describes it. 2 Peter chapter 3. If you want to turn there, you can, but I'll read it for you. Chapter 3, verses 11 through 14. Since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought you to be? That's a good question. Let's rethink our life in the fact that this is all going to be destroyed anyway. Okay? What kind of people ought you to be? You ought to live holy and godly lives as you look forward to the day of God and speed its coming. That day will bring about the destruction of the heavens by fire, and the elements will melt in the heat. But in keeping with his promise, we're looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth where righteousness dwells. So this is the point he gets out of all this. There's a new creation coming. So then, dear friends, since you're looking forward to this, make every effort. I love that. Make every effort. Do all you can to be found spotless and blameless and at peace with him. Noah knew the flood was coming. We know the end is coming too. The final new creation. This will be the last one, right? This is the end. This is what it's all been from the very beginning, leading to anyway. And we're going to be a part of it, which is exciting. Yeah. So we have about 5 minutes. Let's do questions and comments. Bob over here.
I just assumed you were just shouting, want people to shout answers during.
Oh, Sloan, can you use the microphone if you're going to talk?
Is it on? Okay. I just wanted to bring out the fact of God's fantastic love. He sent a Redeemer. Now, what happened to the people of the flood who sinned? They died. What happens to us? We can cry out to a Redeemer. God wants to justify everyone. He's not willing that any would perish. If we don't convey the gospel redeeming message, we're allowing people to die in sin. This is a very important point here. If we expect, if you who've sinned, we've all sinned, do not accept the Redeemer, you're on the wrong side when the fire comes.
Good. Thanks, Bob. Kyle over here.
I'm just the one that passes around the mic. I don't care about what I say.
I'm just kidding.
I don't mean to rewind so far, but keep snapping back to, you said the Epic of Gilgamesh, that was the oldest written account?
It seems to be.
Okay, and did you say that was 2000 BC?
So our copy is from 2000 BC.
Okay. And
I don't date them, but
right.
that's
So maybe,
what people have said.
So maybe dates are off.
But they suggest that it was a copy of when it was originally written around 4000 BC, which would be around the time of the flood, I think.
Okay. Maybe I misunderstood, but I thought you were saying Noah wasn't born until 500 years later.
Oh, sorry, Moses wasn't born. I might have said Noah. Moses, who wrote Genesis.
Got it. Okay.
Wasn't
I was trying to
born
reconcile
until
that.
1500. Yeah. Yeah, I probably missaid the word. Anybody else? Questions, comments? Oh, no, hold on. She's running.
I'm coming.
Writing did not exist for thousands of years. There was an oral tradition. People handed down truth and memory and everything word by word of mouth. And so it wasn't until later that that writing started to exist in a lot of different forms. But anyway, so there is an oral tradition, and we kind of think of oral tradition as not being very accurate, but it was very accurate because the fathers made the sons repeat it word for word, and it carried it down through the generations.
That's true. And they had, I think somebody mentioned this before, but they had much better memories than we do for remembering stories, details. Our overload of information has caused our memory to be not as good as it used to be.
Mike has his hand up too. I have a book. I haven't read it for a long time, probably 60 years ago, when the missionaries first got to Chile. And they had a headhunter converted, Tereri. He told them the story of the flood. Now, when you think of the distance between Chile and Mount Ararat, that story went through the whole world.
Well, I think the flood went through the whole world. Yeah.
Someone had his hand up.
It's true that, passing down and the memory and the repetition, but just like today, along the line, the truth was distorted. These other stories that you're mentioning,
Yeah.
the truth was passed on, well, then somewhere along the line, it became distorted. Man tampered with the truth. And the same thing happens today with the Word of God.
Well, I think this is, if you were in Noah's position, what would you do? And then realizing, oh, we kind of are. Jesus is coming back soon. The world is scheduled for a destruction and a recreation. And like Peter said in 2 Peter 3, what kind of people ought you to be, right? Holy and blameless. So let's take that with us. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We'll see you next week.